Welcome, everybody. This is our our January webinar, and want to invite everybody to settle in for the next 50 minutes or so, and really looking forward to how you think about what we have to say today. Um, just kind of waiting for a couple minutes here for people to filter in, um, and so we'll get started momentarily. Let me put up the slides here, and we can start to get going here. As presumably you know, you signed up for this webinar, employee engagement, workforce retention, and servant leadership. And we think this topic may be particularly relevant to a lot of organizations now, who of course are suffering from lack of employees, from the great resignation and so forth. And so we want to talk about this work that we've really been evolving for quite a few years. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of the layers of understanding that we've gotten in our work at the Performance Thinking Network over the last few years. But anyway, I want to welcome everyone. And hi, Don. Always nice to have you. So let's take it from here. Before we get into our topics today, I just want to tell you about upcoming webinars. We're going to do a little bit more on process improvement. We've had some good conversations with people in the last months about who are real process experts and ways that they perceive performance thinking to be adding value. It looks like in March we'll be doing the session that had to get canceled in December on learning in the flow. We talk a little bit about agile talent development in a few months, building performance infrastructure to scale. One of the things we've been doing is watching how, as organizations grow from small to medium size and larger, how there are various challenges in what we call performance infrastructure that they can face that we can help with. And then we're really excited about next month. Peter Doms, who is a very well-established, extremely experienced strategic planning guy, that we've known now for some years, and we share a background in behavior science, but in the application of that, Peter's been doing strategic planning for organizations large and small for quite a few years. And we've been sort of looking at the strategic planning process for some years too, and recognizing, as for example, Norton and Kaplan, the Balanced Scorecard guys pointed out years ago, that most strategic plans don't get fully executed. And while there's lots of reasons for that, one of the things we think is that strategic plans can be made more executable. And as it says in the sort of subtitle, they're similar to design for manufacturing. The notion that we can build a plan with language and with details in it that make it easier to turn into project plans and so forth. So we're really excited. We've been talking with Peter, and we're going to tell you about sort of what we've learned so far. I want to do the thing I usually do here, which is to ask you all if you would mind filling out a little poll here. I want to kind of get a sense of who's here, and so I'm going to put this poll up now. And if you would please select the option that best describes you. I know some people may fit into a bunch of these categories. But if you can pick the one that best defines your role, this is fantastic. We've got a bunch of leaders and managers here. We got some training professionals, some performance consultants. But I'm actually really happy to see this. We've got other. We never know who others are, of course. You can say in the chat box if you're another. But it always makes me happy on these topics to see somebody, in this case, leaders or managers, because I think that leaders or managers, you'll see, have tremendous control or influence on these issues around employee engagement and so forth. So I think, looks to me like that's settled out a little bit. We got about 40% of the folks here who are leaders or managers. Tied for second are performance consultants and training professionals. And then we've got a few HR folks and some people involved in leadership and management development. So let's keep going then. Thank you very much for filling that out. I always like to have a better idea of who I'm speaking with and who's out there. We also want to point you to our YouTube channel. I suspect that most of the people who are here are familiar with it, you can get to it at performancethinking.tv. We have a set of playlists of short videos on various topics like performance consulting and coaching and so forth. We've sort of paused on that for a while because we've had a change of personnel, but we now have a fantastic professional video person working for us. And so we're going to crank up those short playlists again. But this is also where we put our webinars, where we put some of the presentations. So it's a pretty good resource for people who are interested in this work. And I just wanted to highlight that. And also, this is, I think, the 16th one of these webinars we've done. And for quite a few months, I was doing kind of the first third or so of the thing, giving an overview of performance thinking so people who didn't know about it would have a background. We're going to do a little bit of that today, but if you're not familiar with our work, you can probably learn more than you ever wanted to know at the YouTube channel. So what we're going to do today is to talk a little bit just about, you should be able to see the results of the poll, Bob. And if you can't, I still haven't figured out this thing. I had set it so that it would actually publish those, but apparently it didn't. I can tell you that they're, as I say, 40% leaders or managers, 20% training professionals and performance consultants, and a few others. But I apologize. I still don't seem to have this technology in hand. Anyway, moving right along, today we want to talk a little bit about the problem that probably almost everybody is facing these days, which is retaining an employee and engaging employees. And it's kind of a topic that's been around a long time, and we're going to touch, as you'll see on the Gallup 12 employee engagement poll, which is our survey, which has been used for years. We want to give you a really short bit on the basics of performance thinking models and logic. So as we refer back to them, we'll have that context. Again, talk about the Gallup survey and how, as some of you may know, it aligns rather nicely with our 6 boxes model. And then we want to talk a little bit about servant leadership. And it's a topic that has been around for a long time, that we've had in the back of our minds, so to speak, for quite a while. But because of a new colleague and because of greater interest in this, the notion of putting people first is important. And we think that performance thinking provides a way to do that. And then hopefully, if you have some questions, and I hope you will, I hope you'll have questions and comments, we'll have some time for that at the end. So, there is this challenge of retaining and engaging employees. And just a few data. One estimate is that losing an employee costs an average of 33% of whatever their yearly salary is to bring on a new person, hire them, train them, onboard them, and so forth. Whether that's a high number or a low number, it's a lot of money, and it's costly, as everybody knows, to turn people over. The Work Institute claims, based on pretty extensive survey of quite a few thousand people, that something like 3/4 or 75% of the reasons for turnover are preventable, that there are things that organizations can do to minimize that. That's a big opportunity for improvement. And just as a kind of a benchmark, something like 10% per year is considered to be a low turnover level. We've worked in industries with much higher levels of turnover, however. And then, of course, there's the great resignation. There's companies now scrambling to deal with the fact that an awful lot of people are leaving their companies, and it's getting harder to find people and so forth. So that's kind of a timely topic these days. Here's some data that we got from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The best retention rates in 2019 by industry are, interestingly, in government, in finance, insurance, in manufacturing, educational services, wholesale trade. I wouldn't be surprised if educational services has changed quite a bit since 2019, given COVID. And then the worst industries, again, in 2019, which are the data we were able to access, arts and entertainment and recreation, leisure and hospitality. Of course, it's probably worse than that now, given COVID. Construction, professional and business services. So these are big numbers. This is expensive. Another bit of data that we got that I thought was quite interesting from Microsoft, who's done a good deal of research on this, and this is 2021 data, is that 40% of the global force, as of their survey, their research in 2021, is ready to quit. So we got a problem, it seems to me, depending on what organizations and what industries we're in. Now, the question then becomes, why is performance thinking relevant? How can we help, essentially? And that's what I'd like to unpack a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the elements of performance thinking, as I mentioned, though, just in case people are not up to speed on it. What we claim, and what I think is true, is that our work, our performance thinking models and logic, essentially make continuous improvement or performance improvement simple. What we've tried to do over almost 20 years now, actually longer than that, is take all the complicated methodologies of performance improvement, of which there are many versions and flavors, and boil them down to the essentials. And as we say, performance thinking is 21 plain English words and 2 simple pictures that we use as a foundation for analyzing and communicating about performance in ways that are actionable and evidence-based. But as it says in the bright orange color there, what's different about our approach is we use these simple models in this plain English. And so what that has allowed to happen in those organizations that have nurtured it is that people at any level or function can analyze and improve performance, whether as individuals, members of teams, leaders, managers, performance professionals, whatever, and that they can build communities of shared practice based on this language, based on this framework. Because what we're trying to do is drive collaboration across silos, across groups, so that it isn't different groups of people with different approaches, but rather a shared approach, which is not incompatible with others, but provides a simple sort of lingua franca, as they used to say, common language. And we've named our company, and we've named this work performance thinking because almost 15 years ago, a number of our clients said, you're giving us tools and methods, but really at the core of it is that you're helping us to think differently about performance. Now, the big paradigm shift that probably almost everybody here is familiar with could be viewed. I just like this picture and slide, frankly. But George Bernard Shaw's comment, "All great truths begin as blasphemies." It's hard not to think of that when you think of Tom Gilbert, who was a big influence on our work. Tom was, without a doubt, an iconoclast. And his famous statement that probably most people here know, especially if you've had anything to do with our work, in Human Competence, which was published over 40 years ago and is still taught in graduate programs and is still referred to by people, he said, in the great cult of behavior, by which he meant leaders, trainers, managers, everybody who's looking at human performance. He called that the great cult of behavior. He said, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And Tom, as many of you know, went into great depth about this. He talked about, for example, that the worth of an intervention or an effort to improve performance is equal to the value of the accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior that it increases, divided by the cost to support and produce all that behavior. And so this has been a huge impact on us and many of our colleagues, many of you, I think. And as you probably know, some years ago, we coined the phrase work outputs to use in the place of accomplishments. Because if you look up the word accomplishments, first of all, in the dictionary, a lot of it means completion of behavior. There's more definitions in the regular dictionary related to completion of behavior than to the products of behavior. But more importantly, as we looked at the field some years ago and looked in the literature, we recognized that accomplishments meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we wanted to define accomplishments as countable things, as well-defined things that we could define, say what a good one was, count, measure, and enable people to produce. And so we've coined this phrase work outputs, again, as many of you probably know. And so we have the first of our 2 models, the performance chain. And, we always subtitle it how behavior produces business results, because we start with the end in mind, with the organizational level results that people as a whole in an organization are trying to achieve. And so you can see those examples of things which really reflect the success of a whole organization. And once we know what's at stake, whether it's for a big project or a small project, or whether we're simply speaking to one of the people on our team and saying, hey, we need to improve this, in whatever the context is, if we can identify the business results or organizational results to which whatever the intervention will be or whatever the effort will contribute, we all get grounded in an alignment with the organization. And then we say, okay, let's take a look at this performance. What's involved? What are the work outputs? And so, as again, many of you know, that list are types of work outputs, words that help people to prompt, and find and identify work outputs, whether it's the contributions of an individual or a team or a process. And once we know that, it's pretty straightforward to figure out what the correct behavior is with some observations, some interviews, some task analysis, some best practices analysis. And then finally, once we've defined those elements of performance, we look at what all the things are that are influencing. So that's our first simple model, and there's a lot to it, as many people here know. But it also leads us to the second model, which is that whole behavior influences column can be an awfully long list. And so another of Tom Gilbert's very important contributions was his original behavior engineering model, which basically had these categories, but it was the cells in the model had language that was often misunderstood by people. So we revised that language over time in the late 80s to come up with this. And then eventually one of our clients at Dun & Bradstreet recommended we call it the 6 boxes. So the thing about this model is it's deceptively simple, since performance is complicated under the surface. But as someone who has a background in behavior science, who studied with B.F. Skinner, who did basic behavior science research, as well as instructional design and performance improvement over the last, shockingly, almost 50 years, what I know is that there's nothing from the science of behavior or the study of behavior that won't fit into one of these cells or combinations of them. And also as a practitioner, as a business person, as somebody who's been involved in the so-called real world, I also know there's nothing we've ever seen that can be arranged or that exists as a support for performance that doesn't fit into this framework. So it is an elegantly simple framework where the connections between the cells and the cells themselves are a way to look at how all the factors work together to support performance. And we'll definitely come back to that in a few minutes. We have a logic built on this, and I've already sort of mentioned it, but just to take you through it quickly, again, we figure out what's at stake for the organization in any context, whether it's coaching an individual or doing a 3-year multiple organization project, any level in between. We want to be sure we know why we're doing it. And then we say, okay, what are the work outputs involved? And we have various tools and techniques for identifying those, whether they're in processes or to define a role or the performance of individuals. And we want to know what good ones are, what makes them good, what good looks like, as some of our colleagues say. And then we say, okay, now that we know what the outputs are, what's the necessary behavior to produce them? And then we say, well, those are the things we can measure. We can measure behavior, we can measure work outputs, we can measure business results. Let's think about what the most convenient, easy, indicative way to monitor performance going forward when we begin to intervene. And then we look at possible interventions, and we use a 6 boxes model, and we figure out what's working. We do an analysis. We see what the pluses and minuses are in each of the cells of that and what's missing. Sometimes there's just stuff missing completely. We brainstorm possible ideas. And this is really where the design engineering component comes in, where we're really saying, let's brainstorm. Let's not just go to the usual subjects. Let's be really clear, learn from our colleagues, learn from individual performers, learn from exemplary performers, learn from best practices, brainstorm possible improvements in the 6 boxes. And then let's work with our stakeholders, whether they're senior leaders in a big organization or the person that's sitting across the table from us that we're trying to coach. Let's choose what we want to put in place, define some action steps, implement them, monitor them, and continue to adjust them. So this is our logic that can be applied in a whole range of ways. And of course, many of you all already do this, but that's our performance thinking program in like 10 minutes. Now, the cool thing about this that we've learned is that there's virtually nobody at any level, in any function, in any organization who cannot apply this at some level. We've worked with high school educated people working in small manufacturing organizations on the production line. We work with senior executives in giant companies and everybody else in between, training, performance improvement process, you name it. And people can use these models in this language. So that's the kind of performance thinking piece. So the question is, how does this help? And some of you already kind of know the answer to this, but we've gotten a little bit more deeply into it recently. So hopefully this will be new even for some of you long timers here. Now, the first thing is the performance chain gives us a way to begin to engage people because, as probably everybody here knows, just from personal experience, if you as an employee or a worker in an organization don't really know how that day-to-day activity that you are engaging in contributes, it's not quite so engaging. But if somebody comes to you and says, that form you're filling out 30 times a day, if that's accurate and complete and on time, it could have an effect on regulatory compliance for the company or on service quality or, or customer satisfaction. Or, that relationship that you're trying to develop with people in the other department. Well, if that works, if you can play that out well, and if you can establish and maintain that relationship, that will improve operational efficiency and so forth. So the idea of being able to connect people up through work outputs to organizational level business results is a pretty big deal. People like to know how they contribute. And one of the things we observed very early on when we became kind of knowledgeable about this accomplishment or work outputs thing is that it's kind of hard in many cases to say, well, if you'll just behave this way, it's going to make a difference for the organization. If you'll just ask more open-ended questions or present the message or whatever it is, yeah, maybe that's persuasive. But what I've learned, and seeing Bob Redeker's here also, he's one of the people I've spoken with a lot about this over the years, is that if you can define the thing that people produce that's valuable, and you can explain to the person or the team or the whole organization why that thing, whether it's a relationship or a decision or a contract or a widget, how that thing delivers value to the whole organization, that's going to get people's attention. And so that's kind of a starting place in performance thinking for employee engagement. We recommend certainly that coaches, managers, and leaders routinely talk to their people about that connection. But we also know that if we are performance improvement professionals, training and development people, HR business partners, you name it, and we can have conversations with our stakeholders and with the people whose performance we're trying to support and enable about how what we're producing here makes a difference. That's a pretty big step on the path to employee engagement. We also realized many years ago when we looked at the 6 boxes model that there's kind of an interesting system going on here, because one of the things Tom Gilbert called box 6 motives. And we expand that to motives and preferences because a lot of times people have preferences that are related to how they like to get feedback, what kinds of consequences work for them and so forth. But we put attitude in there too. And the reason we put that word in there is that what we found is that box 6, if you will, somebody's motives, somebody's preferences, how engaged they are, is quite related to how those first 5 boxes are managed. So if I know what I'm supposed to be doing in producing box 1, and I'm getting pretty consistent feedback about that, and it's not all just critical feedback, there's a fair amount of, yeah, that's good, you're doing a good one there, let's do more like that. And if we're given the tools and the resources that we need and the time and the people and the tools and the process designs and all the rest of it, and they're working pretty well. And if there's some consequences, even if it's just successfully achieving the outcomes that we know we're supposed to be achieving, or if it's a thank you from our boss, or if it's anything else, if there's some form of positive consequence when we successfully do whatever it is we're expected to do, and if we're enabled to have or selected to have the right skills and knowledge, and if it's a good fit for us, if the job or the assignment we have is a pretty good fit, then we're going to be okay. Then people, we're going to be pretty happy when we walk into the office in the morning. That's generally the experience that people have, I think. But on the other hand, if those first 5 boxes are misaligned, if for example, we get expectations set, but we aren't given the resources we need, or the rug's pulled out from under us, and all of a sudden 2 months into the project's like, sorry, we can't give you that staff person anymore, resources. Or if, for example, mostly we get punishment or negative consequences when we don't succeed, or if we really are not given the opportunity to develop skills, if any of those things are misaligned, negative, not working together, then we're going to be looking like that young lady in the picture. It's not going to be easy to fix it. We can't just do an attitude adjustment. So the thing that we learned years ago, just from a logical point of view, but also experientially, is that we can manage people's engagement, attitude, positivity or not in relationship to their workplace and their work by being sure we've got the first 5 boxes pretty well aligned and as good as they can be. That's a big deal. We learned that years ago. But there's more to it than that. And it's been, used to be, I could say a few years ago. Now it's probably 10 years or so. But many of you, I'm sure, know about the Gallup Employee Engagement Survey. A lot of companies do big, complicated employee satisfaction, employee engagement surveys. But Gallup has this very simple thing that they've been doing for decades, and it's called the Gallup 12. You can Google it if you don't already know about it. And what they do is they have employees fill this out on a scale from not at all to a whole bunch. I know what is expected of me at work. Well, not really, or yes, I do. And rating scales in between there. Or I have the materials and equipment I need. Or at work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day, etc. You can go down those items. And what they've learned is that this is a really sensitive indicator of how engaged people are. And in fact, the data are pretty compelling because Gallup and Harvard Business Review and a whole bunch of others have looked at these data over the years. And what they say is that if you look at companies with respect to the results of this survey of all their employees, the companies that are in the top 25% in their, of this survey, there's 37% less absenteeism and employee turnover. That just right there is worth a lot. There's many fewer, 48% fewer safety incidents. There's fewer product defects. There's higher productivity. There's higher profitability. This is real stuff. And as, again, you probably know, for this reason, a lot of senior executives, owners, and business leaders have gotten quite attentive to this issue of employee engagement. Now, what stunned me when I saw it, again, probably a decade ago, was when I started looking at that list, I said, wait a minute, this looks familiar. And you might quibble a little bit about where some of these items go. Some of them could even fit in more than one cell in the model. But fundamentally, the Gallup 12 items, which are what those bulleted things are, fit rather nicely into the 6 boxes model. And just take that in for a minute, because what that means is that if you're a manager, a leader, a performance improvement professional, an HR business partner, whatever your influence is, if you can arrange conditions that allow for positive, aligned behavior influences in this model, you probably are going to be well on your way to a pretty strong employee engagement score, if you will, and some of those bottom line results. So leaders and managers, one of the things that the Gallup folks often say, and the people who talk about that kind of research often say is, you really work for your manager. You're kind of working for the company, they pay the paycheck, but fundamentally the conditions under which you work, you're working for your manager. And so how can leaders and managers help? Well, quite a few years ago we did this, and then we've done it repeatedly as part of some of our management leadership programs and so forth. We've asked people in a room, before COVID, when we could do real flip charts, like, what do leaders do? And so we've come up with lists like that. They provide vision, they offer guidance, they set an example, and so forth. And then we've asked the same kind of question: what do managers do? And we separate these out. I personally think that all of the discussion about what leadership is and what management is sometimes a little bit overwrought. I think that whether we're called a leader or a manager, we're responsible for our people at some level. And so this is another list when we ask the question, what do managers do? Now, surprise, surprise, what we see is that almost every single thing that is mentioned by people when they begin to look at management and leadership will sort into the 6 boxes. And so it makes very clear that if you're a leader or a supervisor or a manager, you are arranging the conditions for your employees or for the people that you lead or manage to perform well and to be engaged. So that's kind of pretty clear. One of our larger clients used to have still I think has a program called what is it? Something presence on the floor. And the idea was in some environments, you have managers who are to stay in their office and run their spreadsheets, purposeful presence on the floor. And the intention in this organization was get managers out of their offices, get them working with their people, get them observing. It's kind of like the newer version of management by walking around, which was a big thing years ago. But the idea is leaders and managers are responsible for arranging the conditions for people. And one of the things that we've extracted from all of this, and you can perhaps see this as maybe the typeface is a little bit small on your screen, but what we've recognized is that if you take those things into account, and if you take the Gallup data into account, you can pretty much define best practices for leaders and managers in terms of how they align and arrange positive behavior influences. So they articulated vision, they link vision to strategy and daily activity or work outputs to business results. They set clear goals, they define expectations, they arrange for feedback, all those things in box 1, which we always say box 1, expectations and feedback is probably the most important thing, because if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing and producing and you're not getting feedback, all the rest of this stuff's not going to help that much. And secondly, of course, you won't have access to the PowerPoint, but you will get a link to the presentation. Just for you, Lisa. The tools and resources part, again, at some level, leaders and managers are responsible for supporting their people with having the right resources. And so some of these things are things like improving processes and be sure the tools work. That they don't have these insufferable software applications that just don't work. Actively supporting knowledge sharing, being sure people have enough time. Yourself as a leader manager being accessible and available as a resource. And then box 3, saying thank you, saying good job, providing consequences, putting people in touch with the consequences of what they do, emphasizing positive consequences more than corrective consequences, which is something I've had to correct myself on for years, because, if you're a detail-oriented person, you can be a nitpicker, but you got to find all the good stuff that people are doing too. More of it, hopefully, because there usually is a lot more of it. Skills and knowledge. Let's be sure people, whether it's through work, learning in the flow or on-the-job training or formal training or whatever it is, being sure people have the skills and knowledge to do their jobs, being sure that they're well matched to their jobs, and being sure that their motives and preferences are things we take into account and that align with, for example, the values of the organization. So these are best practices of leaders and managers sorted into the model of behavior influences. So we can begin to see then, hopefully, how leaders and managers can function directly to optimize and hopefully take care of those 75% of the reasons that people leave. I mean, if you go back to those data that I presented toward the beginning, if we say that 75% of the reasons that people leave can be fixed, then I don't know if leaders and managers can fix all of them, but an awful lot of them can be fixed. And so there's a huge opportunity here. Now, servant leadership is a word or a phrase that I've known for years, and it's always made me feel kind of warm and fuzzy. I've always felt, both when I've observed really good leaders and managers and when I've tried to be such myself, and sometimes I've failed, sometimes I've succeeded. But I've always thought that the notion that a leader or manager's job is to really serve their employees, to serve the people that they manage and lead, was a really big idea and a really important one. And it's been around for a long time. And in fact, Robert Greenleaf wrote a book back in the 70s called Servant Leadership. He literally did write the book on servant leadership. And, he's written a lot about it, or did write a lot about it. A servant leader focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong. The servant leader shares power, puts the needs of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. And he goes on to say that the best test is, do those served by that leader grow as persons? Now, the emphasis here is not just on productivity; it's on the people. It's on the And so, this book is a good book, and there's a whole lot of other books, and people have jumped into it. Ken Blanchard has a book on extending 1 minute manager kind of thinking and such into servant leadership. There's a lot of things out there about servant leadership, and there's Harvard Business Review articles. There's research. There's a whole bunch of stuff. But I recently had the good fortune of meeting Howard Behar. And Howard was he was basically president of Starbucks from the time Starbucks had something like 28 stores to the time it had 15,000. And he retired in 2007. So it's been quite a few years. And of course, some of you may be aware in the current day press that there's some unionization stuff going on at certain locations in Starbucks. So maybe servant leadership hasn't worked out perfectly there. But one of the things that Howard is still a very active proponent of is this notion of putting people first. And to me, that's the simple value statement of what servant leadership is about. And so he has this little book that he published some years ago called It's Not About the Coffee. And to me, this is the plain English version, the straightforward version, the simple non-academic version of guidelines and ways to serve people. And if I got to know Howard, turns out he grew up in my neighborhood. I just was introduced to him by my colleague, Marty Wyckoff, who I think is probably with us today. And what I've learned in the few conversations I've had with Howard are a couple things. One is, as an organization, for example, Starbucks, and some people who've worked there know this, they did things like provided medical care and benefits and support for your getting more education very early on for their most frontline workers. They've been extremely generous in how they've treated people by and large. And Howard has countless stories about how he and Howard Schultz and the third gentleman who no longer is around work together to address individual issues. One of my favorite stories, actually, and Howard talks about it often, is when he was first working at the organization and he was basically managing operations across something like 25, 30 stores. There was a manager of a store. No, I think it was a district manager that came in to see Howard Schultz, who was the CEO. And he insisted on seeing the CEO. And so, because Howard Behar tried to say, well, I can handle it for you. But he said, no, I want to see Howard Schultz. So he came in, and this was in the 70s. And he said, I want to tell you, Howard, I'm going to try as hard as I can to stay here as long as I can and do my job as long as I can. But I've got this new, rather mysterious illness called HIV or AIDS. And this is before there was any solutions, before there was any medical treatment. He said, so a lot of people are dying from this, and I don't know how long I'm going to be able to last, but I just wanted to tell you I'm going to do the best I can to stick around. And so, to make a long story short, Howard Schultz said two things to him. One, you've got a job here for the rest of your life. And secondly, you've got medical care for the rest of your life, and this is at a time when Starbucks was not even profitable. And so that's just one story, but that's a very personal, humane story about putting people first. And that's the kind of thing that Howard Behar talks about and is a very active proponent of. So this is kind of how this resurrected, if you will, my interest in servant leadership. And what I've thought for years is that our work at the Performance Thinking Network actually provides a vehicle for not only increasing retention and improving engagement, but actually functioning as a servant leader. Now, to get, again, rather, a little bit data-based, I just in a webinar that I saw yesterday, actually, from Forrester Research, it was actually a webinar on sales enablement and best practices, but it said that sales reps from top performing sales organizations say, my company cares for me as a person, not just from a business perspective. So I think that's pretty interesting because the sales world is a pretty hardcore, performance-driven world. And to say that in the best sales organizations, the most successful ones, there's a clear commitment to the people, to the humans involved, I think is a big deal. So when you start to think about taking performance thinking, and in particular the 6 boxes model, and you say, let's say I'm a manager or leader, what are some of the ways that I could actually play out servant leadership, put people first? So, for example, in box 1, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, I can say, let's set some goals for both your personal and professional development. Let's try to help you develop as a person, whether it's through education or things you want to do on the side or part of your job that you really care about that we can make bigger, etc. Or, for example, we can ask individuals, how do you prefer to receive feedback or recognition or praise? Is it more comfortable for you if we do this one-to-one in our weekly meetings? Or do you like to be recognized in the group in public? Do you like that? Because some people don't. Or, for example, just in terms of box 2, like, what do you need? What resources do you need to succeed? What's missing? Or is there a problem I can help you with? Or can I provide support? And if you really follow the notion of putting people first, that goes outside the context probably of the office. It probably goes to things like being sure people are taken care of if they're ill, et cetera. These days, certainly during COVID, I think we've seen organizations try their best to take care of a lot of people, at least some of the better organizations. And then in box 3, at a simple practical level, we of course want to know what an effective consequence or incentive is for a person. But, to get a little deeper, what brings you the greatest satisfaction personally at work? We're going to try to put you in touch with that. We want you to really feel passionate about that. My colleague Brett Denovi has a great thing that he does with his employees, a kind of a principle, because when they hire people at Brett Denovi, which is a big behavioral health organization in the sort of autism and disabilities world, they always try to find out what people like to do. If you didn't have to work, if you could just spend time doing whatever it is, what would you like to do? And what Brett has always tried to do in his organization is to allocate at least a small portion of that person's job to doing that thing. So one of his examples is, had a guy come to work for him, really like sort of, kind of sports and personal training type stuff. So beside being whatever else he was in the company, he let him start a little informal gym club inside the company so that he could be doing this thing he really loves as at least a little part of his business. So that's very practical from an executive, organizational, performance improvement perspective, because it's probably going to keep that person at that organization longer. But it's also humane. It actually takes the person's interest into account. Or, for example, in box 4, how do you learn best? And what do you want to learn? What do you want to learn for the next stage in your career path? What is most interesting to you about this work and what we do here? What can we help you learn? Or even, box 5, is this a good fit for you? I had a colleague and client years ago at AT&T Wireless, Lee Sweeney, and we had a very intensive onboarding program for their customer service representatives. This was at a call center. And one of the things he would always do, he had his second in command, who was a large, pretty imposing guy who, if he wasn't smiling, might scare you because he used to be a master sergeant in the Army, but he's actually a sweetheart. But if he wasn't smiling, you might be a little worried about the guy because he was pretty big. And he would at the beginning of onboarding, he would tell people and say, this is a hard job. In customer service, people are yelling in your ear. You got to use a bunch of systems. You're always trying to problem solve. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's pretty intense. And our training program is designed to mimic that. And so we want to tell you, if you find that this is not working for you, if you find that this doesn't feel quite right for you, we'll help you find another job in the company. And of course, and something like 15% of the people opted out. They said, maybe I'm not fit for this customer service job. And so they would essentially opt out and they'd find them another job. And of course, the interesting thing about that is if you got 15% of your people that you don't have to let go, or they don't quit on you, you've saved some money, but you've also served them personally. And then finally, in box 6, what do you care most about? What is it about our company you care about? Steve Jobs used to say at Apple, he said, I don't want to hire people by giving them a really super high salary. I only want people that love our products. And so, again, it's self-serving at some level, but it's also like get people involved in something they're passionate about. So those are just some examples of how the 6 boxes framework in a conversation can be used to put people first. Now, one of the other insights, and I already touched on it, although I said box 6 was last, is something that my former partner, Cynthia Rhea, said when we first started doing our management and coaching programs. She said, you should start with box 6. And what she meant by that, and what we mean by that, is when you're beginning to have a new employee, or when you're beginning to coach or develop somebody, or somebody shows up in your team, you want to find out what they care about. Because once you know that, you'll be able to adapt how you set expectations, provide feedback, ensure they have resources, et cetera. You'll be able to do all the rest of it better. So that's another way to sort of take the people into account. Now, you can go through some of those best practices that we listed earlier of leaders and managers, and I just highlighted a few of them. But you can begin to see how, as an effective leader or manager, using a 6 boxes performance thinking approach, you can imbue this all with the value of putting people first. And so that's kind of what we like to talk about. We're going to talk about it at our Summer Institute, by the way, too. We're going to get into this in June. Of course, we start with accomplishments. And if we're actually working with individuals or teams, we say, what are the outputs we need you to produce? And we might create an individual performance map. So this happens to be an instructional design manager's job. And those of you who are familiar with our work recognize that you can define a whole job in terms of the accomplishments or contributions or work outputs. So these are all the work outputs that Josh, the individual, is expected to deliver to these different groups and individuals, including stuff he produces for himself that make a big difference. If you're a manager, if you go through our coaching program, you learn how to sit down and do one of these with each person that works for you. And then you say, okay, we can build a whole talent development process on this. We can recruit people based on what accomplishments they've produced, what outputs they produced in the past. We can do performance tests. We can have behavioral interviews. We can then onboard them based on the work outputs we need. We need that job to produce first and sooner and high priority. We can then do various kinds of training, coaching, and performance development for job readiness, again, focused on work outputs. And then we can move them into essentially an ongoing coaching and supervision process, which is a continuous cadence of identifying what's most important to add or improve to that person's job through a conversation, maybe for the new project or for their next step on their career path or something that they could learn to improve. And then we can problem solve with them about agreed upon action steps for improving that. And we can continuously develop people in a way that allows us to adapt individuals' development to the environment. And it might call in the standard training programs or the standard other stuff, but it might also be, hey, why don't you go over and spend the morning with Jack? Because Jack's really good at this thing. You learn from him. It could involve learning in the flow. It could involve a lot of things. It could involve just setting better expectations and clarifying feedback. But anyway, there's an ongoing talent development cycle where we can engage people and adapt everything I've been saying earlier about the focus on the individual's development and the focus on the person. And then, of course, we can do like career path, promotion, transfer, exporting talent stuff based on how people develop. We can also do compensation reviews. So we can build an entire talent development process in an organization built on accomplishments using the fundamentals of performance thinking. Instead of competencies, instead of behavior-based, instead of skill and knowledge-based, focused on the valuable contributions. Now, our coaching program, to get a little shameless commercy about it, is at the core of this. The Performance Thinking Coach is designed to teach leaders and managers and supervisors how to sit down with their people, how to define their expectations clearly, much like that individual performance map I showed you a couple minutes ago, and then to use as a foundation for ongoing conversations about how to develop, improve. And embedded in that, there's no reason why we can't have essentially the elements of servant leadership or putting people first. And so we think this is kind of the engine that can drive both effective talent development, reduction in turnover, and so forth, and servant leadership. We can also, this is my slightly academic article on on culture development in organizations, but we can also look at people's jobs. This happens to be an HR director's individual performance map, but we can both put people first and we can apply performance thinking. And we can, for example, do things like identifying some of the outputs that this person is supposed to produce and begin to look at them through the value screen or the value filter of putting people first, which might change slightly what we produce and how we do it. So we can, again, we can imbue this all with this value of putting people first. And this is, this is kind of a way to approach the employee engagement topic. A lot of organizations, because they are concerned about turnover and they're concerned about employee engagement, try to do some kind of top-down thing, maybe driven by senior executives, and are trying to do some culture change project and so forth. And some years ago, I was working with somebody who went through our practitioner program. And our performance thinking practitioner program, as many of you know, is essentially a performance consulting program where you get a certification or a certificate based on completing a project using our tools and approach. And this particular woman was working she was a PhD, pretty senior person, clinical supervisor type person in a large behavioral health organization. And they were having trouble with turnover at the most frontline workers in that organization. It was very high. It's like 40 to 60% turnover. So they were trying to think about all these things they could do from the top down. I said, why don't you just go, first of all, define the jobs of this highest turnover job role in the company, do the individual performance maps or the maps for that job. And then why don't you interview people using the 6 boxes as a framework for how do you get expectations and how are they working for you and what kind of feedback do you get and how about tools and resources? We have a whole process that we teach people for doing that. And you might discover some stuff. Well, what she immediately discovered was, for example, in box 1, there were all these conflicting expectations. There was the expectation that you were supposed to develop relationships with your client's parents, for example, but you weren't paid for that. That was not billable. So there was this policy that conflicted with the expectation to do the right thing. Or there were tools that just were not working right. Or there were processes that were like frustratingly not working. Or there was mostly critical consequences, et cetera. So she was able to float to the surface by just interviewing a handful of people where all these behavior influences were bumping into each other, were in conflict, were negative, were missing. Because this little funny graphic is intended to show you this is a system. These aren't just separate categories. These things all connect up together. And that motives and preferences box 6, if you think about it from an attitude point of view, if the first 5 boxes are working, then that positive attitude will feed back to the expectation about when you walk into the building in the morning or into your living room, wherever you're working from, this is going to be good. Or if all that stuff screwed up, it's not. So one of the things we recognized was that if you can bring management, leadership, and supervision to the level of individuals and teams, and over time optimize, align, and make positive those behavior influences, you can have a pretty big impact on turnover and engagement. And another organization that we were working with, a growing organization, the CEO basically over time brought performance thinking into her organization. She and her leadership went through our coaching program. Several of them went through the practitioner program. They began to develop their supervisors and managers using this approach. And what I'm told is, and this is like over a period of several years, that whenever their leadership got together and there was a performance issue that they were identifying, they used the 6 boxes as a framework. They identified the outputs and they used the 6 boxes as a framework to problem solve it and try to sort of make it work better. And so she wrote to me this. She said, performance thinking has had a measurable impact on my company. In fact, personally, she said it saved her company. I think that might be an exaggeration to some extent, but she said, our staff retention rate has increased immensely. New applicants report to us that they hear we're the preferred place to work, which is prior to that, they were having high turnover. Employee satisfaction and engagement have increased as well. It helped us move from being a struggling company to one with the tools to overcome any performance obstacle successfully. So to me, that is the almost, paradigm model of what it means to optimize conditions for engagement and satisfaction. So some takeaways from this. First of all, if you shift the focus in your work with people, whether it's at a staff, project level, or individually with coaching and leadership, to focus on people's accomplishments, both their personal and professional accomplishments. Then you can begin to address them in very concrete, specific ways, and you can continuously improve. And you can link those things up to to the organization, and also to that person's values. And if you connect people to the organization's success through their outputs or their accomplishments or their contributions, then you can begin to engage them in like working for the sake of the larger entity. Focus on enabling employees not just to do professional productivity goals, but also think about their personal goals, their career goals, their goals for work-life balance, whatever it takes. And teach your leaders and managers to optimize these conditions. And the 6 boxes turns out to be a good way to think about that. Put people first from a leadership and executive perspective in decisions, in management practices, and continuous development. Those are the kinds of things that Howard talks about in his book, It's Not Just About the Coffee, and that servant leadership people talk about. Build a culture of continuous improvement, engagement, servant leadership. In other words, through your leadership management supervision, begin to create an ongoing, continuously improving environment with respect to these factors. And frankly, of course, this is our shameless commerce bit. We think we've learned that the performance thinking models and logic can really make a big difference because they become a shared approach. We've got our programs, of course, and our coaching program, the leadership modules that get added to that are, we hope, emerging HR business partner program, which we're ready to pilot when COVID hit, and now we're looking for some companies that want to put in place. And of course, our practitioner program, which is the sort of mother of all programs that will allow you to do projects with all of this in mind. A couple of other just things to know about is we're going to have our 11th Summer Institute, come hell or high water, so to speak, in June. We think that COVID's going to be under control by then. It's going to be June 13th to 16th. If you look on our homepage, you'll find a little thing to click to it. You can register now. There's also some videos that you can get to about people from the last one. There's people in this group who've been. It's a really cool opportunity to get together with people and share these ideas and cutting edge applications. And of course, our open practitioner program, which we do every few months for people who come 1 or 2 or 3 at a time. We've got the next one coming up in March. Again, you can find out about that on the front page of performancethinking.com. So that's what I have to say today. I hope it wasn't too much. I wonder if people have any questions, comments, observations, things you'd like to discuss. Or if I put you all asleep. I think DEI, I think that's very interesting. Yes, Kevin. I've not been directly involved in diversity inclusion kind of things, but although some of our colleagues have, one of our long time ago practitioners, Latoya Gilbert at Anthem, I think has been involved in some of that. One of the things, that culture article that I went by very quickly that you can get at our resource library, what it says is, if you define people's accomplishments and outputs, and if you then look at a value statement, and I would say diversity and inclusion have to do with a value that a company actively promotes and integrates into how they do things. If you look at people's jobs or processes, either way, and you're looking at the outputs or the accomplishments in those processes or jobs, sometimes diversity inclusion or any other value doesn't have anything to do with the thing, whatever it is, the output. But you can look at a job or a process and say decisions, things like hiring decisions, resource allocation decisions, things like how we provide feedback. I mean, there's a bunch of different kinds of outputs that both individual contributors and managers produce. And once you define their outputs, you can look at them and say, hey, where does diversity and inclusion even apply here? And if it does, how does it? Does it change the output? Does it change the criteria for good decision? Does it change the criteria for, how we allocate resources or how we plan or whatever it is? And then how do we act differently to make that happen? And so there's enormous wisdom out there now that thankfully has floated to the surface since the last 2 years about diversity and inclusion. And I think that I think that all of that, with people that have much more experience and insight than I do, can be brought to the table by looking at jobs and processes and the accomplishments involved, and then say, how do we have to change or alter or set expectations for those based on these values? Does that make sense to you, Kevin? And please share your comments and questions publicly. I noticed a couple people have done private ones, but I think everybody would be interested in that. I just noticed that your comment was private. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments about this? I always think I probably just talked too fast and probably I've suppressed questions. Okay, Kevin, that helps. I'm glad. Anybody else? Bob, you asked about the results of the poll. I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts about any of this, given that your organization brings human resources to a lot of small and medium-sized companies. I'm wondering if things like servant leadership are part of the discussion, for example, in any of those places. All righty then. Well, we've come to the end of the hour, and I really appreciate your sticking with me for this time. And as I think you will be getting an email probably by tomorrow evening that will have a link to the recording of this presentation, of this webinar, and it will also show up on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that feedback. And thanks, Marty. Yeah, for me, the whole thing about servant leadership is something that I've always sort of found it attractive as a concept, but beginning to figure out how it would look is kind of interesting. All right. Well, I appreciate all the positive feedback. I always like that. That's really nice. So thank you, everybody.